despite this being quite challenging. If you look at the number of clouds and everything, now I'm not actually flying through clouds, but I'm going to try and do that. The reflections are amazing. The colors are amazing. The landscape is, you know, photorealistic. It's just incredible. It just looks so amazing. You know, I'm able to do, like, it's just look how smooth this is. And again, I'm sure unfortunately you may not see this as smooth as I am, but basically this is stutter-free, 90 frames a second, you know, rolls. I've got some misty clouds up there, which are very challenging for the GPU. Yeah. Bay Area, mostly higher ultra settings, 90 frames a second with clouds in VR, in a Reverb G2. So if you want to find out how this is possible, just stay tuned. I'm about to explain everything I've done to tune my PC to make this work as well as it does. And it really, really is cool. And this misty stuff is the most challenging, actually. This mist you're seeing, it really doesn't like this. The GPU hates this, and yet it's actually running really great right now. This is a guide for running Microsoft Flight Simulator in VR on a Windows PC. I'm going to take you through my settings and various optimizations I've made to make this run as well as possible from a visual experience point of view inside the game. Okay, so who is this guide for? This is for people obviously running Microsoft Flight Simulator, and it's for people ideally with a high-end Nvidia RTX card. I have a 3090, but this might work for maybe even a 3080 Ti, and maybe even a 3080 as well. If you have another card, I really don't know what your expected results will be. I have an Intel i9 12900K, which is Intel's latest generation chip. From my experience, this chip is pushed only to about 10% of its potential, so one core is being utilized, and that to me shows that this, in my setup, the CPU is not a limit at all, and therefore it's likely this guide will also work for people who have lower end CPUs, maybe 11900Ks, 11th generation chips as well as 10th generation chips. And then I have an HP Reverb G2. Again, I actually have no idea about other headsets. I'm really sorry. If you have a different headset and you were hoping to get something from this, you might, but I'm sorry if you don't, because it may run very differently. So I just want to double click on one of the points I made just now about being CPU not limited and being GPU limited instead. What I believe is running VR, your machine is working a lot harder to put out two high resolution images, one for each eye, than it is computing the landscape and doing everything else the CPU does. And that's why I don't think CPU is a main limitation for most people running VR at a reasonable resolution. And it definitely isn't for me. That said, I made some optimizations with my CPU to reduce stuttering, because even with a high-powered CPU, you can run into thermal issues. And that is where we're going to start. And before we do that, I'm just going to explain what my experience is like and why I wanted to make this video. I made this video because I have made Flight Simulator look effectively photorealistic, down to the pixels inside the headset. I don't notice any aliasing. It really looks like kind of a retina display. And I'm running at 100% render scale, which allows that. And most of my settings are at high or ultra. Most notably, volumetric clouds are on high, and most of the time I'm able to fly in high cloud settings without losing frames. And I'm getting a consistent 30 frames a second with motion reprojection, which you should look into separately if you don't understand, but basically creates more frames from existing frames in order to make the actual frame rate a lot higher. And so the Reverb G2 is a 90 hertz headset and 30 frames a second created by the game. Motion reprojection is creating 90 frames a second from that. And so what I'm getting is effectively 90 frames a second at retina scale with incredible detail in the landscape, especially if you're a little bit higher than ground level, and a really, really high, very realistic setting. And I just love it so much I wanted to share the things I've done to get here. And again, I do have a very high-end system. Hopefully this works for slightly lower-end systems I just mentioned. I'm sorry if it doesn't work for you, but hopefully this is helpful to you anyway, because I'm going to take you through everything you could possibly do, even if you don't have my exact hardware, in order to improve your experience and to optimize it. And then I'm going to finally do, so I'm going to take you through the CPU and overclocking and undervolting. I'm going to take you through GPU, also undervolting and overclocking. I'm going to take you through my Nvidia control panel settings. I'm going to take you through my Windows mixed reality settings. I'm going to take you through the OpenXR developer tools, which is a very important addition here, as well as the OpenXR Toolkit, which is the most important addition. Finally, I'll take you through my Microsoft Flight Simulator settings. And perhaps most importantly, I'm going to leave you with some things you can change quickly on the fly every flight, depending on the conditions, which will let you experience the best possible setup for your particular setup. Because it turns out every flight is different, and people claiming they have 30 or 50 or 100 frames a second in some setups, in some flights, may then get 20 frames a second in the next flight and be confused. Well, it turns out there's a ton of things going on in every flight. And so it's important to quickly know what you can do if you're finding stutters and not really enjoying the visual experience because there's too much stuttering going on, or slow frame rates, what you can do quickly to make that experience better. And I figured out a few things that I think really improve that. So without further ado, let's start with the CPU. Okay, so even with my 12900K, I was finding I ended up, even with my 12900K, I found that I could improve performance by tuning the CPU a little bit. And I want to explain how to do that for an Intel CPU. Okay, so you're going to need to download the Intel Extreme Tuning tool, which you can just go to any browser and just go to Intel Extreme Tuning and then download it from this website. And they're the latest build. I actually don't even have the latest build, but then you can just download it straight away. Okay, so you download it, open it up, and while you're running Flight Simulator, what you want to do is check out whether you're being thermally throttled or not. And even with my CPU only hitting 10% during Flight Simulator running, I was finding I was getting thermal throttling. And when the thermal throttling was occurring, I was getting stutters. And why is that? Well, the answer is you're using one core, but that core is maxed out. The heatsink you have attached to your CPU is not able to take the heat away, even though not all the cores are running. And you end up getting stutters. And so one of the key things you can do with the CPU is to reduce thermal load. You can do things like undervolt it. And again, I'm not going to provide a super in-depth guide about this because I don't fully understand it. But what I do understand is that you use less power when you undervolt the CPU. And so in this utility, in the advanced tuning setup, what you can do is you can reduce your core voltage offset. That's one thing to do, or you can reduce your core voltage, say for example, by minus 0.05-ish. And that will reduce your core voltage. Now, it might reduce your overall performance of the CPU, but it will also prevent you thermally throttling. So that's one thing you can do. And another thing you can do is you can take each CPU core. I have 8 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores on my CPU, and turn up this multiplier. Now, you don't want to turn it up too high, and effectively, just to quickly go through what these mean, this is basically your clock speed time divided by 1,000. That's basically what it is. So that's 5.3 gigahertz. And that's the clock speed the maximum clock speed that one CPU will run if only one performance core is running for your load. So you don't want to put it at a very high number for all of these. The reason is because if all of these are overclocked too highly, you're more likely to run into stability issues and the PC will crash. So this is something I played with. I think I upped mine from 50 to 51 all the way up here, and then from 50 up to 52 and 53 up here. I played a bit until it worked. And what I ended up with is, and you can test it, you can do a score, and in fact I did one earlier today, and this was higher than my stock, despite using less power and never thermally throttling. And so the other thing you can do with your CPU is you can change the fan curves using the BIOS to improve thermal efficiency. And this stuff really does matter. I mean, you might not want to get into the weeds with making Flight Simulator more efficient because you're only into Flight Sim. But honestly, one of your issues may well be that the CPU is causing stutters by being thermally throttled. And even with my high-end CPU, I found that. And that's why I wanted to share this, because even though my Flight Simulator doesn't use anything like the full CPU load, as I said before, thermal throttling, which was this bar was going red while I was in Flight Simulator, was causing me stutters. And by reducing my voltage, using a better fan curve, which effectively means the fan is basically louder all the time, which doesn't bother me at all when I'm flight simming because I have the engine noise and headphones on anyway, it actually improved my performance significantly. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. And I'm just going to write this as a summary down here. Sorry for the loud keyboard clicks. My microphone is right next to my keyboard. So let's talk about this. We're going to, we can undervolt to reduce power. We can overclock to increase performance. And I think, although I mentioned it at the end, the most important thing perhaps is to increase fan speed using BIOS to reduce thermal throttling. And I think if you have a 10th, 11th, or 12th generation CPU and you aren't 100% confident about your thermals, you should look into this. I have what I thought was a pretty good heat sink, but it turns out with this high performance CPU, it actually was thermally throttling, even on one core. It was causing me issues in Flight Simulator. So that's the first thing, CPU. Now moving swiftly on to the GPU. And for the GPU, you do not need to use BIOS. You only need to use something called MSI Afterburner. And again, you just go on Google, type MSI Afterburner. It's a free utility, completely free. All the powerful tools you get with Afterburner come for free, so just download it. Now, you might see online, if you go further into the Afterburner world, people have all kinds of different user interfaces. The reason is they seem to like these different skins. So don't worry too much about that. What it basically means is that everything is the same within Afterburner, but you can change the way it looks. So what I did with my 3090, my RTX 3090, which also increased my performance in Flight Sim, was if I reset this back to how it was, here it is. I did something called undervolting to reduce the thermal load on the GPU and make the GPU more efficient and potentially increase the life of the GPU. And I also overclocked it. And so it's similar to the CPU. You want to undervolt it and overclock it for usually best performance. And the way to undervolt a CPU, in my case for my 3090, was you take the core clock and turn it down by something like 295. Okay. And then you click on the graph here, which is a very small click for me. And you get this graph. And you want to pull a point, say around, well, it can be between, I think around between 800 and 900, somewhere like that. And pull it up to around the clock speed that the GPU is clocked at. And in my case, it's 1950. So I'm going to pull it up to just over 1950, which is about 2000. Now, you don't want to pull it too much higher than that. And the reason is you'll actually cause the GPU to crash. The good thing about that is it doesn't actually cause any lasting damage. You can reboot the machine easily, and it will lose these settings, and you can redo them. So, sorry, cat. I'm just going to move you to one side. So when you've done this, when you've dragged it up to just over the normal clock rate, you click the tick mark back on this thing, and it will jump up and create this little curve. And then that's it. So that's basically you've overclocked it by increasing the default clock speed from 1950 to 2000. And you have undervolted it by allowing it to hit that clock speed at a lower voltage, very similar to the CPU. That's the way I understand it. Again, I'm not an expert. Please look into this in more detail if you'd like. The next thing with the RTX 3090 you can do is you can increase the memory clock speed by up to 1000 megahertz. And then what I'm going to show you is basically what mine looks like after all this is done. So here's my curve. There it is. I think I pulled a point up around, looks like around 1925. That's where I pulled up. The lower voltage you go, the less power you'll use, but the less stable it will be. So if you pull a voltage like 850 all the way up to your 2000 mark, what you might find is although you use a lot less power, the GPU becomes unstable and it will crash. And again, it's not a huge issue. You just restart your machine, the settings are lost. But you might want to consider that, and you might want to have a slightly higher voltage, which you pull up to the clock speed, the max clock speed you'd like. So that's what you do there. And then finally, very importantly, what you want to do is have some sort of custom fan here to keep the GPU cool. And I have a very aggressive fan here, which basically ramps up fast as it gets between 50 and 60 degrees. But by keeping the GPU cool, again, you increase the performance and you also increase the life of the GPU. And that's something I did as well. So I want to make sure that I have a custom fan speed on, and that sometimes gets reset when you update your drivers. And so you can go back in here, you click on enable user-defined software, automatic fan control, use firmware control mode, and then you can adjust these points however you'd like to make sure the fan is running. And what this means is your GPU fan and your CPU fan will be running more than they normally are, but you will get better performance in Microsoft Flight Simulator. And assuming you're listening to engine noises, this shouldn't be a problem. The last thing you want to do is make sure this is running on startup by clicking the Windows button. And then back in the settings here, you can say start with Windows, start minimized, and then that's basically what you want to do. So when these settings are actually saved to the GPU, but it's nice to have Afterburner running in the background just so you can keep an eye on temperatures and things like that and make sure it really is overclocked, because sometimes it does reset to default, as I said, when you update drivers and other things or when it becomes unstable. So good idea to have this in the back pocket all the time, keep an eye on it, but really made a difference for me. So to summarize, basically the same as a CPU. Download MSI Afterburner. In fact, and with CPU, I'm going to add, you need Intel Extreme. Undervolt, overclock, and increase fan curves using default, using custom curves. Yeah, there we go. So that's the GPU. Okay, now the Nvidia control panel. So the first thing I want to note about the Nvidia drivers and the control panel is I have found that this update, which is 5.11.7.9, which came in February 2022, again, this may be out of date now, so please keep an eye on the latest drivers. Most of these settings and everything will stay current for at least a year from this video. It may be longer, but the drivers may not. That said, the latest driver, I think, is a 5.12 version and is not as performant as this. I did find the 5.11.7.9 had a significant increase in performance over the previous one, which is quite rare with a graphics card update. Normally, people update them just because they think they should, or they forget them because they don't matter. And both are usually true. In this case, it was not. In this case, 5.11.7.9 was great for me. So if you're around the Q1, Q2, 2022 timeframe, you might want to stick with that driver. I think you're going to find it's very performant. So that's the first thing I want to note about NVIDIA. Okay, now I'm going to take you through relatively quickly my settings for the NVIDIA control panel for Microsoft Flight Simulator. So most of these are set to the default settings in the global settings, but the important point is the program settings. And what you want to do is you want to select Microsoft Flight Simulator from this long list. If it's not on the list, you can click Add and find the program. You can browse it in your file manager. And when you've done that, I'm going to suggest you change a few settings. Now, one thing to note about my entire setup is it is tuned towards motion reprojection. And there are some disadvantages with motion reprojection. Although it gives you full 90 frames a second in the headset, which is amazing, it does create artifacts. And some people don't like those artifacts. Some people find them distracting. I've got used to them. I love the trade-off. The trade-off is you have a tiny bit of artifacts, which are basically like kind of watery marks around the edges of fast-moving points in the VR view, which the watery points are smaller. I think the smaller the ratio between the frames that you want, which is 90, and the frames that you have, which in my case is 30. So if you were running 1:4, which would be 22.5 frames a second, go into 90, 1:4, I think you have more watery, glossy areas. And that's part of the reason I think people have been dismissive of motion reprojection, is because it actually doesn't look good as you get down with a frame rate. But at 30, I find this glossy, kind of watery artifacts actually do not bother me at all, given that when I look down out of the cockpit in VR, I literally see glassy, smooth scenery moving by, and it's incredible. And that is, to me, worth the trade-off of these glossy, these sort of watery artifacts, which you'll definitely see if you turn it on. So this setup is tuned for motion reprojection. So it's not tuned for the maximum frames per second my graphics card can output at all times. It's tuned to lock the frames per second at around 30 frames a second to allow for that smooth 1 to 3 motion reprojection. I do suggest you try it if you haven't. If you hate it, then you might want to use a different setting. Let's go through the settings which are normal. So all these settings are normal. This is not bolded, which I think is a bug in Nvidia, but I have set the max frame rate to 31. That's something you should change. So let's scroll down. This is, other than setting the max frame rate to 31, there's only a few other settings I would change. Make sure power management mode is on prefer maximum performance. Texture filtering, anisotropic sample optimization off. Texture filtering quality high performance. Texture filtering trilinear optimization on, threaded optimization off, vertical sync off, virtual reality pre-rendered frames 1. And those are my Nvidia settings, and they seem to work great. To find the settings for Windows Mixed Reality, we go here on the Mixed Reality portal, we click on Settings. Okay. And I'll take you through all my settings. Now, I have Windows 11. Your UI might look a little different, but the actual settings should be basically the same. So I don't think there's anything different in audio and speech, but in startup and desktop, there are some important things. Hello, Amanda. The first thing is I don't want it to start whenever I plug it in, and I don't want to start Windows Mixed Reality for Steam VR. I just don't want it to start when I'm not running it. Please just let me to decide when to run Windows Mixed Reality. And by the way, if you hit the VR button in Microsoft, it does open Mixed Reality. So I don't know why you would need all these other settings, so that's fine. Desktop view, I do not want a desktop view when apps gain focus. I don't want anything to do with that. Please never show me that ever, because I'm never going to use it. And then virtual displays for apps. This is something that was a strongly wished setting that some people would manage to hack into some sort of register and figure out how to do this, but now you don't need to do it. Untick this. Untick create virtual displays for classic apps. Who needs them? You're never going to use them probably. Definitely don't help with Microsoft Flight Simulator, probably the opposite. Okay, we're going back into the main settings now. Environment. Now, I'm going to show you something later, but I would reset the home unless you have some sort of great, mixed reality home that you want to save. Clear environment data is a really important setting, and I'm going to explain why later. But basically, that's something I do almost every flight. And the reason is, with the HP Reverb, which uses inside-out tracking, it gets confused and thinks that my head's in a different position than it actually is, but relative to where it was last time I flew. And that can cause kind of these drifting things to happen when you're in the cockpit, and also stutters, which actually increase the load on the GPU because you're moving, it thinks your head's moving fast when it's not, and it's distracting and reduces performance. And so if you clear environment data every time you jump into the headset, you basically, I've always found that basically fixes those problems, because it resets the current head position and the lighting environment, which could change if you don't have a studio set up, every time you fly. And that's been a huge important performance improvement for me with the HP Reverb G2. Okay, headset display. Visual quality of your home, low. I want low app resolution, just don't give me anything quality at all. For the quality of the home, I don't care about that. Experience options, let Windows decide. So display resolution set to 4320 by 2160. That's a little bit misleading because actually each display is 2160 by around 2160. It's not, each display is not 4320 by 2160. Neither is they're one display, there's two. So it's a bit misleading, but whatever. The frame rate set to 90 Hertz. And sleep timeout I have at 5 minutes. That doesn't actually matter very much. And that's it. So that's it for my mixed reality settings. And let's just summarize that there. So per the video, can reset environment data each time you fly. Yeah. There's one quick addition I want to make, and that's within the Windows Mixed Reality, make sure the mirror is off. So the mirror is the thing which shows what you're seeing in virtual reality. You can start it and stop it by pressing the play and the pause button inside the Mixed Reality home portal. I'd highly recommend you keep that off. Unlike the preview, which shows the two eyes when you're flying in Microsoft Flight Simulator in the Flight Simulator app, this, I believe, reduces performance by having a second mirror. In fact, I'm almost 100% sure it does. And so I highly recommend you have this off at all times. And you do that. If you have it like this, if you have these two bars, it means you have it on. You can click pause and then minimize this while you're flying. And I think that's a very good idea. So the next thing is the OpenXR developer tools. Okay, so now we get onto the meat of this. And these are where you get the real performance improvements. So the first thing is to make sure you have OpenXR developer tools installed. So to do that, just search for it online, or actually you can use the Windows Store as well. Let's go, OpenXR developer tools, there it is. It's going to open up the Windows Store for me. I've got it installed, but there you just install it from the Windows Store. Very easy. And let's open it up. Here, oh, actually, that's not it. OpenXR developer, OpenXR tools. Okay, so a little bit confusingly, it's called developer tools in the Windows app, and it's called OpenXR tools in the app you get installed. But it will install this app for you, and it's important to have this app as one of your initial setups. Once you're done with this, you basically never need to touch it again. I don't think I've opened this in about a month, but you want to make sure that in the settings, you're using the latest preview OpenXR runtime. And you want to make sure you use custom render scale and set it to 100%. And then this is the key setting you're going to want to turn on or off depending on whether you are willing to accept the motion reprojection, which has those slightly watery artifacts, but completely crystal clear, smooth 90 frames a second, or to turn it off and have whatever frames your GPU can output at that time, which might vary quite a bit, and also definitely will not be 90 frames a second, I can guarantee it, and therefore will have these effectively like kind of blinking stutters every time you look around, or especially when you're looking down at moving scenery, which when you've tried motion reprojection, I think you might really prefer. And so I have mine always on, but you can change that anytime you want. Again, this entire setup is not designed for optimizing motion reprojection off, because I'm not so familiar with that. Great. So let's just summarize this. This is very easy. Download and install render scale 100%, latest runtime, motion reprojection as you wish. Okay, great. Okay, now here we come onto the big daddy of all the settings, and it's the OpenXR Toolkit. And this toolkit developed by some really amazing open source developers who actually work for Asobo Microsoft, I think, or one of the other, is an absolute godsend for people using VR in Windows Mixed Reality in particular, but I think it works for some other runtimes as well. For me, it's basically all features are available and it runs incredibly well. And what it does is it gives you a ton of optimizations to improve your VR experience. And honestly, if you only do one of the things I suggest, you must do this, especially if you have the same hardware setup I have, because it just makes such a huge difference. So OpenXR Toolkit, not to be confused with OpenXR Developer Tools, which is a different thing. Search for OpenXR Toolkit. And there it is. And you go ahead and download it. And when you've downloaded it and installed it, it's going to probably ask whether you trust the developer. You should say yes. You'll get this app, and this app allows you to disable it because it's enabled by default. And I have experimental settings set on. I don't need to screenshot, so I've got that set off. I think the standard modifiers to access this menu is with Control and then one of these buttons. I've taken off Control and now I just use F1 through 3. And what this means is when you are in an OpenXR runtime app, so when you're running Windows Mixed Reality and you're running something like Microsoft Flight Simulator, not just in Mixed Reality, but when you're running Flight Simulator as well in VR, you will get a special menu that appears, and that's what gives you all the settings. So this is actually not your settings. This is really just to kind of configure where the settings are shown and everything and how they're shown, and turn it off if you want. And if you want to make sure this is running, what you can do is you can open up the developer tools, which is this other app I just showed you, and make sure in the runtime information, it shows API layers and then shows no vendor toolkit, because this XR API layer no vendor toolkit is actually the OpenXR toolkit, the separate OpenXR toolkit written by the third-party developers running successfully on my Windows Mixed Reality runtime. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now that I've explained how to open up the menu is what it looks like. And we're going to do that by opening up Flight Simulator. We're going to turn on VR, okay? Now I'm in VR. We're going to show the Windows Mixed Reality mirror. Okay, so now we're seeing what I'm seeing in the headset. And now we're going to press F2, that button, and boom, a big menu appears. In fact, it's so big I can't see it properly, so I'm actually going to reduce the size of the menu. Let's make it small. Doesn't need to be huge. I think you can still read that, hopefully, even though it's a bit blurry. And then finally, I have expert settings on the menu, which you might have needed initially. So you probably want to start with these settings and make sure expert settings are switched on. And here's the menu. And I'm not going to go through every single setting, actually, because you can play with it quite a bit. But what I would do is, if you do have a similar hardware setup to me, I would recommend that you basically copy these settings and then play with them as you wish. And I'm going to talk through briefly what they do and explain why you might want to change them from the defaults that I have. Effectively, you want to turn on upscaling for sure. And the reason is, even if you don't use upscaling at all, the sharpening layer that this adds is really spectacular and dramatically increases the sharpness within your VR experience. Okay, so you're going to want to turn it on. I prefer FSR. I think it looks better, but you can try NIS. I just played with anamorphic today for the first time. It wasn't meant to be part of this tutorial, but you might want to experiment, because if you reduce the width, the number of pixels rendered on the horizontal scale, it actually doesn't seem to decrease the resolution visibly, at least by 10%. It doesn't increase it. And I imagine because it's rendering fewer pixels, at least a little fewer, it probably renders a bit faster. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. The fact is, if you do have the same hardware setup as I do, you actually can set this to 100%. you can fully render. You don't actually need to use upscaling other than the sharpening, which is super cool. And the reason is we're using motion reprojection, and we're using something called fixed foveated rendering, which I definitely would set to something similar to what I have. And what this does is it basically renders the outside of the screen at a lower resolution than the inside of your VR display, making it so that there is a lot less GPU power required to render your entire image, but you don't really notice the blurry areas on the side of the image. And again, these are the settings which I have, which I think significantly increase performance without decreasing the visual clarity too much. It does require you to kind of look at things a bit more, because if you just move your eyes, you will notice there are sort of blurry areas towards the edges, sort of artifacts. Anyway, so try setting these settings: inner resolution 1x, inner ring 35, middle half, outer ring 50%, outer resolution 1/8. Prefer vertical. It's quite important that you prefer vertical if for certain problems that you are encountered with rendering the horizon. Now, horizontal offset and scale and vertical offset, these basically move the areas that are cut out or blurry. They move them around, the sharp areas in the middle. They move them, I think they move them kind of in and out and up and down, and you can decide where you'd like them. I found this worked really great for my eyes, and that might be somewhere you can start. So what you're trying to do is you're basically trying to make it so that you can't detect that there's anything really wrong with the image, and yet there's a huge number, fewer pixels being rendered because you're rendering the outside of the image at lower resolution. So these are the settings I would have for your performance. Now, if I go F3, I can move through to appearance. This is huge as well. This enables you to actually change the colors within the VR display, which basically no other vendor allows. There's an overlay for Steam, some sort of Steam toolkit, which basically puts a filter on top, which actually doesn't look very good. This is actual core controls of brightness, contrast, and then saturation of red, green, and blue, which is huge in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I can't overstate this. It looks too green and too warm and too saturated. It's too green, too warm, and too saturated, at least in the Reverb G2 when I am in the world. It doesn't look realistic to me. You might like it because it looks more like an Instagram photo. That's fine. Some people actually prefer that. I don't like it. These are my settings. Highly recommend you try them out. Try increasing the brightness a bit, increasing the contrast a bit, decreasing the red quite a bit. This starts at 50, by the way, so I brought it down to 33 from 50. Decreasing the green quite a bit, and then increasing the blue a little bit. If you are in a plane, or even if you're just driving along the freeway and you can see some distant mountains or whatever, notice how blue they are. The world is quite blue. The world is not green and warm all the time. I mean, really, when you do this and get used to it, and then switch back to what you can do quickly is you can just sort of switch back to global. It immediately looks just so fake in comparison. And so I really, really love this setting. Thank you so much, developers, for including this setting. So world scale is amazing. World scale lets you change the virtual distance between the eyes more than the slider on the headset does. And this enables you to change the effective size of the cockpits of various planes, some of which definitely are too big, so you feel like a small, like a mini person sitting in a giant cockpit, and some of which are too tight. You feel like the cockpit's too small. And you can change the world scale to basically mitigate that problem, depending on your plane or the planes you tend to fly. Amazing setting. I tend to have mine a little bit smaller because I find most of the cockpits are a little bit big, but you can play with the settings and your results may vary. And in field of view, I keep at 100%. I used to have it a little bit narrower, but it doesn't. If you're running 100% render scale, it doesn't actually improve things at all. Shaking reduction, also amazing. What this does is prevent as much jittering when you are breathing or even your heart is beating and the headset is moving slightly. So I have mine down by 40%, which I got used to and works really great before you do the rest of these settings. Okay, and that's the OpenXR Toolkit. Absolutely amazing piece of software, absolutely essential if you're running Microsoft Flight Simulator in VR. And highly, highly recommended to install. And then if you have no idea what you're doing, maybe you could try my settings initially and work from there. Again, don't assume that they're going to necessarily work best for you unless your hardware is identical to mine, in which case I think this is probably about as good as you're going to get. Otherwise, just do play around. Okay. So in summary, download and install Toolkit. ensure running. Ensure running. And then settings per the video. Highly recommended. Okay, finally, before we get onto the things I do every time I play, let's get into the Microsoft Flight Simulator settings. So we're going to turn off VR. And we're going to start with PC. And you might be like, well, why would you care what's on the PC? Well, I think it may matter. And the reason is you might start in PC and then it loads a ton of assets which it doesn't need and then loads them into VR. So I think this might, unless you play, if you also play on PC, you might not want to change these settings. But I have basically everything on the lowest setting possible for PC, except, and this is quite important, text resolution. And the reason is, if your text resolution is set to low, in some planes, when you jump in VR initially, it will use the PC setting and not the VR setting for texture resolution. This is a bug. It may not be still there, but it was there a few months ago, at least with the Milviz Corsair, which I flew. And this was super frustrating. And when I changed this, I eventually figured out this is the reason. It was fine. The problem was basically on this, with this being in low, I'd sit in the cockpit. Everything would look incredible and be really high performing. And I had a ton of overhead performance available on my GPU. And then all the textures within the cockpit were blurry and I couldn't figure out why. And that was why. So I'd set that to ultra, make sure it's as high as you'd like it. And then everything else set to the lowest possible setting. And then make sure you've locked frame rate limit to 30 frames a second. Not sure this makes a difference, but might help you. And that's for PC. And then I have my PC set to full screen rather than having any other windows. Now, it's kind of fake full screen with Microsoft Flight Simulator. It doesn't really run full screen. It runs kind of in a window that's made giant. So, but what I like about this is I'm able to actually stream by having it on the full screen. At least that's using that. At least that creates the VR mirror as big as it can possibly be. So when I press the VR button, you can see it's basically creating the full screen. And by the way, one of the reasons you're going to want to reset the environment settings is you don't want the headset to be picking up movement on your monitor as something that it interprets as you moving your head. What I mean by this is if you are sitting in front of your monitor and it's bright and quite big in front of you, and then you put your headset on, your headset's going to think, oh, your environment, part of the environment is whatever I'm seeing on the screen. But the problem is when you start moving your head around, what's on the screen because of the VR mirror is changing. And that does create problems in VR. And so it's worthwhile turning your screen brightness down, or maybe minimizing the window, or just resetting the environment settings every time within VR to make sure this isn't a problem. This really was a problem for me. And I improved it by, as I said, resetting environment settings every time. And making sure I have a very bright room as well. And that the lightest thing in the room cannot be your desktop monitor that you're using for your PC. It just cannot be. It has to be brighter somewhere else, or you have to turn off your monitor or something like that. For the HP Reverb G2. Okay, let's go to VR. The most important settings here are, and I won't go through them in all of them. In fact, what I'm going to do is just leave them on the screen for a few seconds so you can pause the video and copy them down. But you always want to keep your render scaling at 100% inside Microsoft Flight Simulator. And I'll show you later how you can improve the frame rate by doing something else, but you don't want to change this. And let me just let you skip through the settings. I'm going to leave it with the first screen here for a few seconds. And then I'm going to scroll down in 3, 2, 1. There we go. I scrolled all the way to the bottom. And these are my settings. Okay. So what we want to do is ensure PC settings are set up as well. ensure monitor not brightest thing in room, VR, Microsoft Flight Simulator window is small, and then settings per video. Okay, now finally, and this might be the most important part of this, is every time you fly, and I'll just leave this up here while I chat. Every time you fly, your situation is probably going to be different. You're going to be flying a different plane. Yes, different planes use different amounts of GPU and CPU. You're going to be flying in different locations. You're going to be flying with different weather, okay? You're going to be flying with other people or not. And all these things make a difference to the performance. It's important to know you can't just set one setting and expect it to run perfectly all the time unless it's a really, really low setting, okay? And you might want that. But you might want to also enjoy the clouds on high, for example, which do look really beautiful in VR. You might want to enjoy high resolution textures on the ground and high resolution buildings. And to do that, you may also need to occasionally tune down some settings in order to get great smooth frame rate all the time. And you might want to do this really quickly without trying to think about what it is that you can change. And so I'm going to just take you through the two things which I think are the biggest wins when it comes to frames per second in VR on my setup. The first one is, so you can change, so let's just do this, resolution. So you can reduce the resolution in OpenXR Toolkit, in the toolkit, and that's the menu inside the VR. And I'm just going to show you that right now, how to change the resolution down, okay? So we're going to go into VR. I'm going to go into the mirror so you can see the menu. I'm going to open the menu up. Let me turn off anamorphic to make this less confusing. It's this button here. You can change this. And so I have mine on 100. I'm going to leave it. This is what it was up until about an hour ago when I was playing around with other things. You can leave this on 100 if you have the hardware I have, but occasionally you might find it's struggling. And if it's struggling, you can turn it down. You can turn it down to 90, you can turn it down to 80. When you start to get lower, you will notice the difference in quality. In fact, as soon as you start turning it down, you'll notice a difference in quality. It will go down, but your frame rate will go up. Resolution is the biggest king, in my experience, with VR. Resolution, resolution, resolution. When it comes to frames per second, it's mostly about resolution. And so that's why OpenXR Toolkit is such a godsend, because it lets you reduce the resolution using these great upscaling techniques while keeping the same frame rate. Now, for very high-end PC, you don't need to reduce the resolution, but if you're finding you're flying in environments that are challenging all the time, you can reduce the resolution. It will improve your frame rate for sure. So that's one thing you can do. Let me just set this back to where it was, because I'm kind of happy with where I had it. And by the way, what anamorphic does is it changes the number of pixels on the width and the height. So you can basically change the resolution without changing one of the axes resolution. Okay, so that's the first thing you can do. Let me go back to Microsoft, go out of VR, and show you one setting that's even easier than resolution inside the OpenXR Toolkit in your headset that you can change and immediately increases my frame rate every single time when there are clouds, and that is the clouds. The volumetric clouds, by far, more than anything else, more than any other setting, have a massive impact on VR performance. Again, I believe this is because these volumetric, basically like polygon-driven clouds are with voxels everywhere, are heavy on the GPU, and so if there are a lot of clouds around, especially if you're flying through misty clouds, all I do is I press escape, I open the menu up within VR, right? You go to general options. While you're in VR, while you're flying around, you're kind of like, oh no, suddenly I've hit some cloudy area and I'm flying through clouds and it's stuttering like crazy. Just switch from high down to medium. And that's it. Immediately my frame rate jumps by 30%, 40%. And that's a lever that I have, and I almost always that's the first thing I'll do if I am having problems with frame rate. And to be fair, on my system, I basically never have problems with frame rate or stutters until I hit a cloudy area, and especially if I start going through these misty clouds. That's when I start noticing performance drops. I turn the volumetric clouds down, immediately it gets better again. And so that is another lever you have. And I would highly recommend you, you might want to try, see if there's others, but I would highly recommend you try those out if you're having issues. So just to summarize, you can change the resolution and you can change volumetric clouds from high to medium. So if stuttering, there we go, turn volumetric clouds from high to medium. And the final thing is I want to talk about, just before you do that, obviously, before you jump into VR, there's one thing I do every single time I fly, which I've already mentioned a few times in the video, but I'm going to mention one more time. And that is, every time I fly, I clear environment data. I keep the head still, and while you keep your head still, clear environment data. In about 5 seconds, you'll see the world might jump. And if the world has jumped, that means that it was worth doing that, because it's basically reset the environment based on your lighting conditions for the headset to basically recenter your current position where you are, and you will get fewer stutters while you're flying. It always works for me. I do this basically every time I fly now because it helps a lot. And that's the thing. Reset environment data in Windows Mixed Reality settings. And that's it. This has created some incredible experiences for me, and maybe just now we can jump in and I'll show you basically what it looks like. I'll take you to the Western Isles, say in Scotland, in VR. Let's have a quick look. So. Here we go. We're going to reset environment settings, clear environment data. There we go. You see it jumped. That's exactly what I'm talking about. That shows it wasn't well set up before. Now let's go to the Western Isles in a Spitfire. So a third-party plane. Let's go to during the day. Let's go to, yeah, Barra. Let's just do Barra. Why not? Is this the kind of place I want to be? And real world weather. It looks like it's pretty cloudy actually. So we'll see how this looks. Now the preview you're getting is a screen capture of one of the eyes inside the headset, and so it's not going to be super high quality for you, but it just gives you an idea. So there are not many clouds right now, but that doesn't matter. We can actually increase the number of clouds to make this a little bit more challenging, just to show, and I'll see if I get any stutters. But so I do have a few artifacts, which is normal with motion reprojection. Let's get our okay. Let's open the cockpit for a nice view. Reduce the throttle, and I just think this is so beautiful, especially with these colors. Okay, so let's make it a bit more challenging. let's get some clouds and stuff going. Because again, the clouds are so beautiful. Why negate the clouds? Why make your benchmarks without clouds? There we go. That's a bit more challenging. Okay. And I'm going to bring up my frame rate monitor, which hopefully will show up. There we go. And if I'm getting 30 frames, that's motion reprojection working at full 30 frames a second. And you can see I'm getting 30 frames a second pretty much the whole time, despite this being quite challenging. If you look at the number of clouds and everything, now I'm not actually flying through clouds, but I'm going to try and do that. The reflections are amazing. The colors are amazing. The landscape is, photorealistic. It's just incredible. It just looks so amazing.